She never fell in love with you. That is the first truth most men spend years trying to avoid. She fell in love with the emotional movie playing inside her own mind. And you? You were simply cast as the lead character. Think carefully about your past relationships. In the beginning, she looked at you with an intensity that felt almost supernatural. She admired things about you nobody else seemed to notice. She projected greatness onto you before you had even earned it. She called you different, special, unlike other men. And for a while it felt intoxicating. You thought you had finally been seen. But what if you were never truly being seen at all? What if she was not responding to your reality, but to a psychological fantasy she desperately needed you to fulfill? This is where Carl Jung becomes dangerous. Because Jung understood something most modern relationship advice completely ignores. Human beings rarely love each other directly at first. They love the unconscious projections they place onto one another. And nowhere is this more destructive than in relationships between men and women. Jung spent decades studying the hidden architecture of the psyche, and he discovered that every woman carries within her an unconscious masculine image he called the animus. This animus silently shapes how she perceives men, judges men, desires men, and ultimately becomes disappointed in men. The tragedy is that most women are completely unaware this process is happening, and most men are even less aware. So they enter relationships blindly, mistaking emotional intensity for genuine connection, never realizing they are stepping into a role that was written long before they arrived. A woman possessed by projection does not see the man standing in front of her. She sees potential, symbolism, emotional utility. She sees the hero who will rescue her from emptiness, the rebel who will awaken her emotions, the protector who will stabilize her chaos, or the wounded man she can fix to feel psychologically significant. But none of these roles are actually you. They are fragments of her unconscious mind searching for completion through another human being. This is why the beginning of relationships often feels irrationally euphoric. The projection is strongest before reality interferes, before your flaws appear, before your humanity becomes undeniable, before your exhaustion, fears, imperfections, contradictions, and emotional limits interrupt the fantasy she created. In the beginning, she does not want truth. She wants transcendence. She wants emotional intoxication. And projection creates exactly that. Jung warned that projection is one of the most powerful psychological forces in existence because it replaces reality with imagination, while convincing the individual they are seeing clearly. A woman under projection genuinely believes she has found the one. But what she has actually found is a screen upon which her unconscious mind can project its deepest fantasies. This is why men become confused when women suddenly change. One moment she idolizes you. The next, she criticizes everything about you. One moment you are fascinating. The next, you are emotionally unavailable, disappointing, selfish, distant, or inadequate. What changed? Often, not you. What changed was the collapse of projection. Reality entered the room. The fantasy could no longer survive contact with truth. And when that happens, many women unconsciously resent the man for failing to remain the character they imagined him to be. This is one of the darkest realities Jung ever explored. Human beings frequently punish others not for who they are, but for failing to sustain an illusion. The man becomes blamed for the death of the fantasy, even though he never created it in the first place. And because most men desperately crave female validation, They begin twisting themselves into impossible shapes, trying to restore the original admiration. They become performers. They over-explain. They overgive. They lose boundaries. They sacrifice authenticity in exchange for temporary approval. Jung would call this psychic suicide. A man who abandons himself to maintain projection slowly becomes hollow inside. Modern men are especially vulnerable to this because society trains them to derive identity through female approval. From childhood, boys absorb the idea that their worth depends on being chosen. Movies teach it. Music teaches it. Social media amplifies it endlessly. The desired man is portrayed as successful. The rejected man is portrayed as invisible. So men unconsciously organize their entire personalities around becoming emotionally acceptable to women. But Jung believed this creates fragile men, because any identity built upon external validation can be destroyed externally as well. The moment her attention changes, his entire sense of self collapses. This is why breakups psychologically destroy some men. They are not simply grieving the loss of a relationship. They are grieving the collapse of the identity they built around being loved by her. Without her admiration, they no longer know who they are. Jung believed the path out of this trap was individuation, the brutal process of becoming psychologically whole, independent of external validation. But individuation is painful because it requires a man to confront the parts of himself he has spent years avoiding. His dependency, his insecurity, his emotional hunger, his fear of abandonment, his desperate need to be chosen. Most men never confront these things honestly. Instead, they distract themselves with constant pursuit. More women, more attention, more achievement, more noise. But underneath all of it remains the same terrified question. Am I enough on my own? Jung understood that until a man answers that question internally, he will remain psychologically vulnerable to projection. He will constantly seek women not from love, but from incompleteness. Most men never reach this stage because confronting oneself is terrifying. It means admitting how much of your identity was performance, how much of your behavior was driven by fear of rejection, how much of your personality was constructed to gain approval. Jung believed the ego resists this confrontation violently because illusion feels safer than truth. But without this confrontation, a man remains psychologically fragmented. And fragmented men are easy to manipulate. They chase affection compulsively because affection temporarily silences their inner emptiness. They tolerate disrespect because abandonment feels more terrifying than self-betrayal. They lose themselves inside relationships because they never built themselves outside them. One of Jung's darkest insights was that human beings often prefer comforting illusion over liberating truth. A woman may unconsciously prefer the fantasy of a man over the reality of him, because fantasy protects her from uncertainty. Reality is unpredictable. Reality contains flaws. Reality demands accountability. But fantasy can be controlled internally. This is why some women repeatedly chase emotionally unavailable men. The unavailable man allows projection to survive indefinitely because his distance prevents reality from fully emerging. She fills the gaps with imagination. She romanticizes ambiguity. She mistakes emotional uncertainty for depth. Jung would say she is not in love with the man. She is in love with her own projection, reflected back at her through him. Likewise, many men become addicted to emotionally chaotic women because chaos activates unconscious wounds they mistake for passion. Jung believed people are unconsciously drawn toward relationships that mirror unresolved psychological conflicts. The psyche attempts to recreate familiar emotional patterns in hopes of finally mastering them. But without consciousness, this repetition becomes destructive. The man repeatedly chooses women who validate his insecurity. The woman repeatedly chooses men who validate her fantasies. Both remain trapped in unconscious cycles while calling it love. The individuated man eventually begins recognizing these patterns. He stops interpreting attraction as destiny. He stops romanticizing emotional intensity blindly. He stops confusing projection with connection. And this makes him different from most men. Calmer, slower to attach, harder to manipulate emotionally. He no longer immediately molds himself into whatever version a woman desires. He observes instead. He watches whether she sees him clearly or merely responds to fantasy. This is why individuated men often appear mysterious. Not because they are playing games, but because they are no longer performing constantly for acceptance. Jung warned that most people never reach this stage because it requires unbearable honesty. It requires looking directly at the wounds that drove your behavior for years. The fear of rejection, the fear of loneliness, the fear of not being enough. Most men would rather stay distracted than confront those demons. They keep repeating the same relationship patterns, blaming different women while never questioning the unconscious emptiness inside themselves. But the few men who do confront it, the few who willingly walk through psychological fire, emerge fundamentally different. They stop seeing relationships as rescue missions. They stop worshiping romance like a religion. They stop expecting women to complete the parts of themselves they refuse to develop. And this is where true freedom begins. Not freedom from women, freedom from illusion, freedom from emotional slavery. Freedom from the unconscious desperation that made him vulnerable to projection in the first place. The individuated man can love deeply without losing himself. He can connect without becoming dependent. He can walk away without collapsing emotionally because his identity is no longer built on external validation. He understands that real love is not possession. It is not obsession. It is not fantasy. Real love begins when two whole people meet without needing to consume each other to feel complete. But Jung's darkest insight may be this. Most people never want truth. They want comfort. They want fantasy. They want the illusion because illusion feels safer than reality. Reality demands responsibility. Reality demands self-awareness. Reality forces you to confront the parts of yourself you spent your entire life avoiding. And that is why genuine self-discovery is so rare. Most people would rather stay asleep than endure the loneliness required to wake up. So if you are listening to this right now while carrying the weight of heartbreak, betrayal, confusion, or emotional exhaustion, understand this carefully. Your pain is not meaningless. Sometimes the collapse of illusion is the beginning of consciousness itself. Sometimes losing the fantasy is the only way to finally discover who you really are beneath it. And maybe the greatest thing she ever gave you was not love, but the destruction of the false version of yourself you built to keep her. Because the man who survives that destruction without becoming bitter becomes dangerous in the deepest psychological sense. Not dangerous through anger, dangerous through awareness. He can no longer be manipulated by fantasy because he sees fantasy clearly. He no longer abandons himself for validation because he has already faced the emptiness that validation was hiding. He becomes emotionally sovereign, calm, grounded, internally free. And once a man reaches that point, something extraordinary happens. He stops chasing people who cannot see him. He stops performing for attention. He stops begging for emotional certainty. Instead, he begins building a life rooted in purpose, truth, discipline, and self-respect. And from that place, he no longer attracts people through desperation. He attracts them through authenticity, through stillness, through presence. Carl Jung never promised comfort. He promised transformation. He warned that the path toward becoming whole would feel like death to the false self. And maybe that is why so few people ever walk it. But the ones who do become impossible to control, impossible to manipulate, impossible to break through illusion again. So remember this carefully. She may have loved the fantasy, but your task was never to become her fantasy. Your task was to become yourself. If this message spoke to something deep inside you, don't let it disappear into the noise. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more psychological and philosophical explorations inspired by Carl Jung, Nietzsche, Machiavelli, Unamuno, and the hidden truths of human nature. And remember, the moment a man stops chasing who others want him to be is the moment he finally becomes dangerous enough to be free.